Thank you so much for joining us. I have the distinct pleasure of having Lulu Demise and Nathan Richardson here to talk to us about diversity in financial technology and financial services. Nathan, as many of you know, is the Executive Vice President, the points guy. And Lule is the president of Ally Invest. And both of you are really at the forefront of conversations about financial technology and diversity. For those of you in the audience, my name is Chris Brummer, and I'm a professor over at Georgetown University Law Center. And I also host the Fintech Beat podcast, where I've had the pleasure of exploring many of these issues. And I'm really looking forward, like you, to picking the brains here of some of our foremost thinkers and doers, not just in the space of financial technology, but also diversity. I think I'll just kick it off with a very broad statement that I think we're all sort of familiar with. The conversation on race in this country is rapidly changing. And one of the elements of that change is that people are becoming much more aware of the significance of race, and they're really asking themselves deeper questions about what race and racism could mean in their own workplaces, in particular in finance and in technology. But is this moment really a different moment? And I'll start with you, Lule. Like, when you think about the conversation on race and financial technology, how does diversity figure into the business strategy of companies? And how powerful or not is diversity as a business proposition against this new backdrop of increased scrutiny and awareness of race as being essential in terms of,
Yeah, I think when I think of sort of diversity and inclusion being really the most important ingredient in that, right? If you bring a cluster of diversity into your organization, but you have done nothing to sort of break down walls as a community in that company to connect relationships and people, then all that happens is you've created fiefdoms, and inevitably there will be some hierarchy that leaves brown people behind. I mean, let's get real. That's typically what happens, right? And so I think whether it is when we're thinking about the race question, we have to think of it in a multidimensional way. So there is the element of what does a good person do to leave behind an earth that's just better, right? There's an element of whoever said to themselves, I want to have the same dish every day, all the time. Like, nobody says that. Diversity, by definition, is the vive la différence in our lives. And so, to my mind's eye, the people that resist it, it is either because of fear or lack of exposure, right? So I think of diversity, one, as it's just the right thing to do as a human being to create equity in this world. Two, if you don't do it, you will not have a rich experience in your life. Your company and your industry will not be as innovative because it will be culturally irrelevant. I mean, we're actually kind of seeing that in our geopolitics right now, right? When you don't have diversity, what you suffer from, right? And then lastly, there's the element of, but whether you like it or not, America is turning into a minority-majority, multicultural democracy. And so that means your consumers and your workers are going to look different. And meanwhile, as an industry, you haven't found the narrative, the language, the structure to make that home for those customers and those employees, right? So I think the imperative nature of diversity and inclusion is multidimensional. I don't think it's just about bottom line numbers. I think it will be that as well. But I think it has to be all of those things. And once you look at it through that lens, I mean, who does not want that future? I mean, whatever your skin color, whatever your orientation, I think what we have to do now as industry leaders, and what I try to do as a leader, is to show that inclusion is a practiced art. I didn't wake up and suddenly, just because I'm brown and a woman and gay, I know how to include people. Like, I practice this every friggin' day. And so I think what we have to do now is teach our industry how to practice it in a way that is meaningful and transformational.
You know, that's a really interesting set of observations. On the one hand, particularly when you think about fintech as a business proposition, it seeks to scale But at the same time, you have people who are demanding, precisely because of technology, much more customized solutions, right? And so you have to ask yourself, how can you do that? How can you reach more people on the one hand, while at the same time really speaking to their immediate needs? And it's somewhat counterintuitive that in the fintech ecosystem, that these kinds of questions are having a particular salience. Because people are looking at how far some pockets are falling short. Richard, when you think about sort of the transformative potential of this moment, who are the kinds of key players and what are the kinds of key steps that you see as being necessary when it comes to taking this increased awareness and translating it in a way that where you see changes on the ground, both in terms of the VC end of things and also in terms of the fintechs?
You're raising what I call the opportunity question. And to me, the structural changes that need to happen in our overall economy are best done by fintechs. And they are generally VC backed or angel backed. Because let me just give you some facts on the major financial institutions, because they're not going to do it. So our entire financial system was set up to serve the straight white guy, help him get a mortgage, help him get a loan, help him build his wealth. And that was set up after World War II. And that's still the system. And, just to give you some stats, 1 in 25,000 people are dedicated to diversity at the major banks. 1 in 25,000. Let that sink in. That's not a priority. Less than 1% of the vendor contracts at major banks goes to diverse suppliers. Less than 1%. It's not a priority. So all of you in the fintech space, all of us, let's realize, our opportunity to fix the structural system and capture new markets is in the failure of the major financial institutions, right? They are failing at addressing this. They've had an opportunity. They've had people hitting them with sticks. They've been given carrots. They've been given every opportunity for the last 70 years to be inclusive, and they're not doing it. Okay, they can talk about it all they want, but it's a checkbox for governance, and it's not really doing it. Okay, even on the board level. So what I mean is we need to go beyond having apps that are addressing some of the inequalities. So when people talk about a payday app and helping people that work at Walmart manage their cash flow, that's a great feature product, but that's not structurally changing wealth creation in this country. And that's where the opportunity lies. And I am hopeful because there are some, we're starting to see funding go to VCs that are female focused, LGBTQ focused. And I think in even, there are some minority funds that are focused, but we need more of them and we need them at a bigger scale. So they're not funded the way that Sequoia or Andreessen Horowitz are. So we need funds that are truly focused on people of color and diverse and inclusive populations to push founders to come up with ideas that structurally change a broken system that's failed us for generations.
Lulu, maybe you can follow up on that, because there's some really great insight that Nathan is bringing in. Really looking at diversity as both a moral imperative, but also a business opportunity arising in part because of the failures of the legacy financial system. When you look at those entities that are best positioned to take advantage of that failure, as he also noticed, they're not exactly the most diverse institutions either. How do you navigate this particular quandary, right, where you have this enormous business opportunity, but where, as you said, you have to sort of change and educate an entire class of capital providers in a way so that they can understand, what that business opportunity is and really change the way in which they're talking and speaking about this particular set of business opportunities?
Yeah. So, I mean, I agree with Nathan. I think that this thing is going to take an army of people tackling it in different ways, right? So there's one angle that I think Nathan mentioned, which I think is very essential. So I work for a fintech that's neither establishment nor a startup. It's this hybridish sort of thing, right? The bank's about 10 years plus old. We're a fully digital company. And so I'm kind of like at that intersection of establishment and fintech. And I cannot afford to forfeit the penetration of the establishment. So my basic premise is the hiring practices and the promotion practices, because what I know for sure is, in the immortal words of Hamilton the musical, you need people who are in the room. If they're not in the room, they're not shaping the customer experience. They're not shaping the culture of the company. They're not shaping the hiring practices. So my maniacal focus is how to bring more people up the ranks. You don't only, I mean, the reality is not everybody's going to be a startup. Let's get real, right? Like we need to be able to give people of color a means to have a successful career in different ways, right? And what's happening right now is not just because of the boardroom blockage of opportunity. Just look at the ranks of, like, go down below manager or go up north of manager. You don't even have to go to the boardroom, right? And leakage in terms of people of color, diversity candidates getting hired at the lower level, and then leakage. And so you can conclude only two things from this, right? You can either say, well, that's because Black people just are not as capable, right? You can literally make that conclusion, right? Women are just not capable. And it's really just these groups that are more capable. You can make that conclusion, right? Or you can say that there is no such thing, and science has taught us, as a difference in human capacity based on race, gender, or anything else. 99% of our makeup across every racial divide has already been proven out by scientists to be exactly the same. So then you have to think to yourself, okay, if people are not broken, or is it the system that's broken, right? And so I choose to look at the system. And my objective is to figure out how to impact the system so that Joe Public straight guy, his email address, his LinkedIn accounts, his Twitter accounts, everything is more diverse. Because if Joe Public doesn't have people in his life, he is not going to hire people, right? And so ultimately, that has to be part of the equation as well. How do we influence hiring practices, promotion practices, nurturing of talent in a way that has equity in who rises in these institutions?
Well, one of, to that point, people don't know that, the number of, for example, Black engineers that are created every year rivals the number of Black attorneys, and yet you don't necessarily see the engineers, on the payrolls of even major technology companies. And there's this kind of mismatch as to, what's happening to the talent beyond the founders, right? What's happening in terms of the employment decisions for individuals who may not necessarily be working in as founders, but for business development or marketing or as software engineers, business strategy. And that kind of conversation is not one that we're really having a lot of in the fintech space. Nathan, when you look at this question, the question of how do we diversify the very ranks, the very DNA of our fintech firms, really in ways to empower them to become better at providing the kinds of services that they're aspiring to provide, how do you strategically think through that? I mean, is diversity and pushing on diversity at the founder stage the right moment to do it? Sometimes people will say, well, just give me a little bit of time until I ramp up and get a little bit larger, and then I can think about those kinds of issues. At what point and at what stage does the question of your human capital, from this vector of diversity become more important to a fintech company, and at what point do they need to understand that value added is available the second they start to hire these people?
So the only way to solve this in any company is to make this a cultural value, that it needs to come from the top. and it needs to be something that's owned by the leadership and is understood and practiced by everyone. And I'm not talking like, a training that you go to. I'm talking like they're asking the question when they get a list of candidates back from recruiting, and they are networking regularly at going to the right places. And it can happen at the early stage. I've certainly founded a couple companies, and we never had, an issue of like saying we want to make sure that we are a diverse company. And it was less intentional than it was just who we were as a diverse group to begin with. So that begs like this selection bias that a lot of people are more comfortable with their pals from their Ivy League schools or their fraternity, and it's easier to like continue the conversation about work after work at a bar or at a club or whatever you happen to be doing over tennis or golf. But we need to break that. And I think, I want to go back to one thing that Lule said that I think is really important, which is that this isn't on you, Lule. This is on me. This is on everyone on this call to ask the question about recruiting and to own this and take responsibility for it. And I think that people don't get how important it is and how a simple question can make a big difference. So I've served on a couple of boards, so I'll anonymize the board. And I asked for a gender pay equity study to be done. And it wasn't what you would want it to be. And, I said, this is not going to be acceptable moving forward. Another startup I was at, a British company bought us, and they were like, they're sticking me with an all male board. And I was like, as a gay guy, sort of pre Will and Grace, I was like, I'm not going to be in the room with you guys like that. I want a woman in the room. I want this to be diverse. I will be a misfit in that room. But you have to ask, and it's on us, all of us, to like push these boundaries and to ask those questions. And people are going to react the right way. They're like, yeah, you're right. We need to do that. Rarely do you get pushback at this point. I'm also hopeful about the next generation because they are less, I guess they have fewer prejudices than past generations, largely because of social media and what they're seeing in the press. So that's actually really positive. But for me, it's really about, everyone asking the questions and making sure that they take ownership for this, not just, the affinity group dedicated to LGBT people or people of color. It needs to be everyone that's joined at the hip on this.
Yeah, you're mentioning, this next generation. As a university professor, I'm very, very well aware of young people and the fact that, this up and coming consumer class, they are demanding and they expect to see action. And that's why you're seeing so many of them so consistently pressing for change, particularly in the industry. Lily, getting back to one of your first comments and really following up on something that Nathan had mentioned. When you think about this increased demand and energy that's being focused at not just the political class, but also the financial and technology class, what does it mean for you? I mean, Nathan had sort of made a couple of observations, but for you, what does it mean for this moment to actually be a transformative moment? What kinds of things would you want to see? How quickly would you like to be able to see? Well, not how would you like, but how quickly can we expect to see some real structural changes in the industry? And what's your general sort of sense as to the mood of the industry and the robustness of that mood for deeper structural change?
Yeah, and you and I were talking about this earlier. So I definitely am an incrementalist by nature. I am married to a revolutionary, but I am an incrementalist by nature. And I do believe that, but that doesn't mean that any incremental step is this, they're not all created equal, right? What I feel about this moment is that the incremental leap we're going to make is bigger than other moments we've had. And I think there's a real sort of, it's not just about our industry, it's the fact that, as I said, we will be left behind. I mean, we are going to be, by definition, a multiracial democracy. Consumers will be multiracial, our workforce will be multiracial, and our industry will be this antiquated, does it sound like anything we know? Antiquated, doesn't know the language of how to engage in a multiracial democracy, knowing how to talk and speak and be inclusive. And there's no doubt about it that innovation is going to suffer from that, right? So to my mind's eye, like, what I want to see out of this moment is more courage on everyone's part. I always tell people, like, I put my foot in my mouth all the time. I don't think Black people call me out and say, you shouldn't have said that. Like, nobody has the purview to not making mistakes, right? But the reality is, I've decided that this, and I will contradict Nathan in this, it is on me. It's on all of us. You know, but for the grace of God, we have a privilege of sitting on this call and the jobs that we have, regardless of what our skin color is. And so to me, like, what motivates me is knowing that my part is, one, to do what I do well. And I tell this to people all the time. Like, you earn the right to be a troublemaker when you're good at what you do as well, right? So I coach people all the time, master your craft. And part of mastery of craft, and this is the insidious nature of racism, is that by definition, we all feel like we're carrying the race on our shoulders. So we can't make mistakes. And this is one thing I've realized. I cannot master my craft without making mistakes. Like, there's no definition of, like, mastering one's craft and being better is leaning in, risking, and making mistakes and failing, right? And yet, so what I would like to see out of this is more courage from Caucasian folks who know how to speak this language and come in and falter and trip and make mistakes and learn and teach, right? It's this thing about white anxiety is not a falsehood, right? So we need to figure out the vocabulary around it, right? For people to be able to articulate it in a way that doesn't sound racist, but doesn't mean we shouldn't find the language around it, right? So I want more courage out of my Caucasian colleagues and friends. I want more courage out of my own, whether it's people that are Black or women, in the sense of, like, you too will make mistakes. And if you are not willing to trip and fall, you cannot excel, right? And so I want the idea of the burden of carrying the race to not be in every Black person's head, because it is what causes us to not take the leaps and the risks to then get the experience that then gets us the scar tissue, that gets us the earning of the, now give me the capital to start my company, right?
Yeah, you talked about two different forms of failure, and the concept of failure is always one that is embraced when it comes to the world of innovation, right? This idea that every founder has to fail a couple of times before they hit it big. It's a process of refining your ideas, combined with this other kind of idea of failure. The failure of our language, the failure for us as Americans to be able to create a common kind of dialogue where we can really engage each other and through our language accept and understand each other's humanity. They're two different kinds of concepts, but they are very, very important and integral to the innovation process, right? Like, on the one hand, whether or not you're a founder and you're starting up something and you may fail, or when you're hiring that entry-level person, right? The rookie software developer who may make a mistake because maybe they're aiming just a little bit too big for what they're trying to sort of swing at. And the questions are, how do you deal with and accept failure, and are the consequences for failure, depending on obviously the dialogue we're talking about, but are the consequences of failure bigger for some than for others? Nathan, you've been a part of lots of different startups. I mean, you're enormously successful and you've seen different kinds of scenarios. But, when you think through how a fintech, when it is expanding, when it is scaling, and when it's perhaps looking, if they're wise, earlier in their development to think about diversity so it becomes an embedded part of their DNA as they grow, there's always that T1 decision focusing on, okay, now I've made my hire, right? And then there's a T2, T3, T4 decision as to what do you do and how do you engage the people or the person or the people that you've hired as you're growing, and to really make sure that you're not moving the goalposts in some way or another, and that you're being as fair as possible. Is there any way to institute within the business strategy and the growth strategy of a fintech firm, not just sort of the hiring practices of getting people on board, although that is enormously important, and uh, any other additional insight on that is always appreciated, but also the concept of how do you make sure that you are acknowledging and rewarding those people for what they do, and if people are not doing what you want to do, to make sure that it's not because of some kind of cognitive bias or just because we're all coming from our own different cultural perspectives.
Well, I think the thing saying that I use that is used in the company that I'm at today is like, give people grace. Like, we're all human and we're all going to be tripping and we're all going to be, having failures at times, but you need to give people feedback and you need to keep them aligned to the goals because, as Lule said, if you're doing your job well, then you have room to stir the pot. And you have room to have, all sorts of other things that are around you. But I think it's on all the managers to make sure that they're giving people clear goals, direction, and feedback. And how people achieve those things may be different culturally, like where they're coming from and how they interact and and I think that's something that takes a lot of practice. I've been managing people for a long time, and my first job was, in emerging markets, and there was a training on like cultural appreciation of differences and being an individualizer. And it's not something a lot of companies embrace. They want you to be sort of monolithic in how you think and how you do things. But I think the strongest cultures are going to be when you embrace people for who they are. And, personally, I have experienced that as a human, right? So I came out in the 90s and was asked some horrible, it's very COVID-like, can I get AIDS from you? And that scar tissue is real. And how I do my job has changed over time, right? Because I'm aware that someone might say something to me and judge me for being gay or for having jazz hands or my voice lilts in a certain way. And it takes a certain type of manager to embrace me, and I'm a special sauce. And I've realized that I gel better with certain people and I can read that pretty quickly. I wish that weren't the case, right? Because, I have a lot to offer if I can, come out of my, container. And I think as a manager, I try to let people out of their container and get to know who they are and what their background is and what the frame of how they look at things is, because that's going to make us stronger.
That's really very interesting, important. Lily, I'm gonna leave you with the last comment and remark on that. But when I was listening to Nathan, one thing that struck me was how important objectives may be, and maybe giving people a little bit more leeway in terms of how they achieve those objectives, and not necessarily to judge how they're necessarily communicating or doing something, as long as they're being courteous and respectful, but to let them be themselves. How do you view this? You talk about failure and embracing failure, both in terms of our dialogue on race, but also in terms of doing business. As we end this conversation, how does that fit into the special sauce that is fintech?
Yeah, I think that what is valuable about fintech is, even without knowing it, as homogenous as it is in terms of who owns it and who runs it, it has democratized money and investing and all these things in a way that actually make it possible for the tent to be bigger, right? So in the sense, I do think fintech's at its genesis and its purpose is an inclusive purpose, right? In terms of at least bringing people into the finance equation. I think what I would say in terms of the secret sauce that we could capture is this. I have never built a team that is wholly only white men and it be more strong than a diverse team. Never. I have never wholly built a singularly female-only team that is stronger than a diverse team. There is something about having different kinds of thoughts, backgrounds, and backgrounds feed thoughts. Like this idea of like, I used to, the usual passive, like, it's not identity, it's frame of mind. I'm like, BS, identity informs frame of mind, right? So people have to look different as well, not just think different, because it's the same, it informs one or the other. But I think that if we could drive for the composition of more diverse teams, whatever the where it is, whether it's the you know, in the squads that are doing it, wherever the decisions are being made, my experience has been is that it's a richer output. And it's not only a richer output, it's a richer journey. As I said, who in the world says I want to eat rice pudding every day? Right? Nobody. But you got to practice this stuff, right? You got to practice it. And so because I'm so well practiced at it, and it's a destination. I'm not saying I'm good at it, like I'm some black belt, but like, because I'm well practiced, I'm not as nervous on differentiating between performance versus developmental needs of people, right? Developmental needs because they're not given what I just told you, the permission to fail as much. It's the truth. You know, I can't tell you how many heartbreaking conversations I have with Black employees who say, I'll not do that again. Oh, yeah. It breaks my heart. Or never do that again. Because again, it's that responsibility of failing as an individual, as a Black person, is failing for the whole race, right? And so, like, ultimately, it is for me, the secret sauce for FinTech is to keep leaning into what is already its secret sauce. Open the tent. You've been doing it in terms of access you've given to investors and savers. Now open the bloody tent on the people who are running this shit.
Excellent. Well, on that, we are going to leave it. I wanted to thank you both, Nathan, Lule, for this conversation. I've learned a lot. I think our audience has learned a lot as well. I'd like to thank everyone who's watched us. And well, I look forward to hearing more from you as we continue this journey. Even from someone who likes rice pudding, but you're right, I never eat it every day. But thank you very, very much for your conversations. This was wonderful. Thank you.
Okay.